approach. One thing that we've developed is what's called the reputation revenue dynamic. This is very much for the private sector. In terms of the last point, revenue, in terms of politics, you can take out the word revenue and replace votes. So there is a political element to it, but we'll use the polite one first. So we always start with data. Our data master is over here, and of course, really, this is where we have to start with. And this doesn't just mean the social media data and all this other kind of data. It's a consolidated approach in terms of understanding data. That data will then inform the content. That content will then go into a specific community. And I think the previous panel keep using this word community, community, community. But actually defining which community it is that you're talking to now becomes incredibly difficult. We may think, okay, we need to communicate to everyone in Turkey or Turkey. This is almost an impossible task. What about communicating to women above the age of 30 in a suburb in Istanbul? This may be the area that you need to deal with the most. So defining communities as a target that you need to communicate to now becomes incredibly important. That communication will turn into a reputation output. So if we think of it as an output or a desired objective, it becomes a very different reality. Then you get the revenue or the votes that you're after. So comes to the point of the idea of the grief cycle. Now, why is this important? One, the entire country is grieving. Yesterday, when I sat here listening to the conversations and listening to all the presentations, it was incredibly emotional. It was incredibly emotional to hear the journalists talk about the time when they took a 1-year-old baby's body, put it in the back of a car, and took it to the hospital. This was an amazing thing. And you can see the tears in these people's eyes. So they are still in the grievance cycle. They're still dealing with this problem. Now, when we take this and apply it to how we're going to communicate, how are the people within, how do we go backwards? Okay, how are the people within this community, the specific community that we're dealing with, knowing full well that they are in the middle of a grievance, they're grieving? How are we now going to design that communication? And I was fortunate enough to meet this lovely lady from the Red Crescent on the first day. And I said, look, I'm coming to talk about the emotional state of people and how do we communicate to them. And I kept using this term, how do we communicate to them? And actually it was the wrong thing. And that conversation was really useful because actually, how do we now listen to them? And that's going to be a very difficult reality for people in positions of power. Communicators like myself like to wear a suit, wear a tie, we have a nice haircut, we behave ourselves. You know, there's another one, the prime example of a well-dressed gentleman over there in a position of power who likes to communicate. We have certain ideas in our head or a certain bias in our head. We know what's best. And we believe it. It's a belief. We believe that we know what's best and what should be communicated. But did we listen? And how do we listen? And we go back, oops. Actually, we've got to go back to the data point. So if we can go back to the data and use that data that can be plucked out of a community and understood, okay, this is now the data coming out of a group of people in a certain city or a certain area that's been impacted by a disaster, then we can put it in the context of this grief cycle. Of course, the KÜBLER-ROSS grief cycle has been around for years. And it's something that we need to think about. But the first part, of course, is denial. You know, you're going through this amazing incident, and you've got to block this out. But very quickly you get to anger. And this is where it becomes very difficult to communicate to somebody. How many of you are married? Yeah. You know, I have this problem as well. When my wife is angry with me and I try to communicate with her, it's a failure. And she's, oh, you think you travel all around the world talking about communication, but when I'm angry, you can't talk to me. I'm like, yeah, it's true. Why? Because she's so angry. In my mind, she's not listening. In her mind, I'm not listening. You know, so we need to learn that the emotional state of the person we're trying to communicate to, even though I'm right, even though she is right, is I can't get my message across. It's quite literally impossible. Even if I have empirical evidence to prove it, it's still wrong. Why? Because I didn't take into consideration her anger. Another thing, and we saw a lot of this content come out in the media coverage, and I really appreciate some of the ethics shown by some of the earlier journalists. Of course, my friend from Australia, who restrained himself at that point where you could have taken that step and got that extra bit of information or that extra bit of context. But I can tell you some of the media didn't. And they quite literally filmed the grief process, the bargaining process. And I still remember it because I was just doing these slides before coming over. Sky News. No one here from Sky News, right? We're not broadcasting. Sky News from the UK. This Turkish woman, she must have been in her 50s or 60s, begging and bargaining on international TV to bring back her daughter. It was quite literally the bargaining process. It was filmed. It's like, why didn't you just take the footage of an execution? You know, it was quite literally that level of thinking. But the reality is, how do we now communicate with her when she's going through the bargaining process? And if you ask the people from the Red Cross or the Red Crescent, it's not just what you say, it's what you don't say. So when we start to design communications, we need to start designing a set of communications that work within this context. At the same time, we need to design a set of communications that shouldn't be used. So now we get to the next part, which, again, I just quite literally copied this from the research. Telling one's story is actually part of the process. And they use the word depression. I don't think it's the right word, but I'm not going to argue with the professors on this. You know, there was a whole bunch of them up here. I was like, oh, man, I'm going to be in trouble later. I don't think depression is the right word, but I think the interesting part for me as a communicator is this part here, telling one's story. Now, yesterday we saw some amazing stories that no one has seen before. Imagine, I wasn't here during the earthquake. I arrived a couple of days ago. Actually, I represent 99% of the world's population, if not more, of people, how they consumed your earthquake. So, for me, this is the reality. And I heard yesterday some amazing stories. And for me, one of the best stories, and we saw after a few days within the communication sphere, a whole bunch of negative stories come out. Oh, it's not going fast enough, it's not going fast enough, the response is not going fast enough. You'll all remember that part. And yesterday, I said, oh man, there's a whole bunch of really good stories that could have been talked about in terms of how you guys collected data, how you can track excavation machines, how you can track all this kind of stuff. Was like these beautiful communications just waiting to happen. And then I spoke with the lady the Deputy Director General from Afet, and she said, I said, you know, you got to do documentaries, got to do this. I was like so excited in my little communicator's world, and I could tell she just was not, no, it's not time yet. So it's like what the Professor Asio said earlier is, culturally, we weren't there yet. We're not there yet. Because we're still in this process. We're not ready. So once we get through this part, we can start to talk about new plans and moving on and getting through that acceptance part. So this may be where you start changing and looking at how you're going to move your planning around communications. Okay. So I once had a very good professor who said, Nordin, you don't know enough about things to make any kind of comments. He said, maybe you're good enough to ask some questions. So I always argue with my professors. It's fine. So question number one, how can we use the grief cycle to inform us of the emotional state of people in disaster zones, both victims and first responders? And I think when we start to design high-level disaster response plans, high-level communications plans, we need to start think of the first responders as well as a key area of concern. And we saw some amazing presentations earlier today of the first responders, and it was like really good. The other thing is, how much can we change victims' emotional state through communications, or do we have to ride out the grief cycle? Now, everyone over the last 2 days have been talking about a very positive approach. How to help, how to be egalitarian about this. How do we do the greatest amount of good to the greatest amount of people in the shortest possible time? This is our intention for in fact, this whole conference. How do we achieve that? What happens when there's a bunch of people who don't have the same objective, in fact, want to destroy? It's an opportunity. The enemies of Turkey weaponized information during your earthquake. They're still weaponizing it today. So if we don't ask this question and they ask this question and they get a really good answer, we're in trouble. Why? We go back to the definition of crisis management, is to maintain that way of life of a group of people. Even if that group of people is 85 million Turks, maybe it includes another 6 million Turkish diaspora around the world, or the resident population of Istanbul. What is that definition? Now, another thing which I hope the researchers who are on the panel answer this question: what are the long-term emotional impacts and how can we communicate effectively in the context of national recovery? So there is we'll talk about a bit, also this idea of control and command. But it has to go in, and you saw very quickly in the president's actions, very quickly, the idea of national recovery. But there were also counter stories around, oh, this certain things weren't done. This thing wasn't done, that thing wasn't done. Time was too short. Everyone also, in every presentation, talks about time. And time has become so important. But how do we understand the long-term emotional impacts so that we can start to build a more resilient, and it's in our name, a more resilient response? A resilient response is not a 1 or 2 week or 1 or 2 year thing. It is going to take quite literally a decade or a generation to respond to this crisis in a resilient manner. You can respond to this crisis in a non-resilient manner, and it can be very fast. And of course, how will this process impact the political landscape? I'll leave that for the political guys. So, considerations. We want rapid communication, we want rapid response, rapid resolution. We all kind of in this like this consumer society where it's everything now. You know, we can blame Amazon and we can blame DHL for delivering goods and services at a heartbeat. But this is a mega trend. Because of these mega trends, you now need to think differently. Now, the ability to use social listening tools and AI to distill sentiment needs to be refined further to filter out the noise and misinformation. Now, we do a lot of work around what's called the Dragon Bridge attacks, which is a whole thing around the US-China trade war, dispute, problem, whatever word you want to use. But there's a whole set of fake communications that take place, and it's done using cyber social means. Completely fake accounts, but using computers to ensure that this entire communications take place. At, like, literally some guy press enter and then the whole thing runs. But how do you respond to that? So if this is happening in the midst of your crisis, you don't have the tools or the team or the understanding, if you don't have the proper social listening, if you don't get the proper data, you will be misinformed. You will make poor decisions. And everyone in this room, in terms of those communicators or part of those communications strategic teams, your job is to understand what's going on. You'll brief the minister will brief the prime minister or the president. Your information is paramount. Gaps in that information quite literally will cost lives or cost careers. Anger and fear, we heard that word a lot the last couple of days, are the most dangerous emotions, but they also make for the best images on news. And I think this is something that we've got to balance. And this one is my favorite. If you're not the hero of this story, you're the villain. And I think this is, again, when you start to understand what is the objective of your organization. What is the objective of people within your organization, and what's the objective of organizations that are competitive to you? Political, military, even criminal. You know, we don't have the data now on how much criminal activity took place during this disaster. You know, looting is often a big problem. Okay. So we're seeing strategic shifts, and we're kind of moving away from the grief cycle here, but I just wanted to share some observations that I made, you know, thousands of miles away. Crisis communications teams are required to be ready and to operate in disaster zones. So unfortunately, we got to take off our fancy suits and get down and get our hands dirty. And preparedness needs to be measured in minutes, not hours or days. So this is because of how fast the news operates. And I think this is, it doesn't mean you have to be there in 5 minutes, but you need to have communications ready. So, screenshot time. Afet logo is there, wonderful. This is something I took from Al Jazeera, I think a couple of days afterwards. President is there, and if you see on the left, who knows who that guy is? He's the host of this entire event. So he's quite literally, he's in a sense communicator in chief. He is down there on the ground. I'm sure there's 100 people, or at least however many people there. So tick the box. The director of communications were there, informing obviously the president, and also informing that they're informing the president. It's one thing to say that you're doing the job, but now you need to show that you're doing the job. This is quite literally a global show and tell exercise. So we're going back to kindergarten. You know, we didn't make it out of primary school yet. So the fact that this is there is, for me, a very good example of getting things done. And interagency. First responders. Now you see a ton, and I'd love to get the data from our guy. Imagine, first responders were hunted down by everybody, I don't know, to be the voices during that time, because they are the ones who are, quote unquote, the experts of what exactly is happening. So we need to get the data of this and understand it. Turkey has to be the prime example of disaster response, and we need the data. So during that crisis, and we spoke with the gentleman from Spain just now. Where is he? He's not here right now, or maybe he is. And I asked him how many of the first responders are trained, media trained. And it's not a big thing that is done for first responders. They're like this guy. You know, he's like quite, and you saw a whole bunch of heroes this morning as well. There's a bunch of really tough guys who look really good in their outfits, and you can just chuck them out of an airplane, they'll land with parachutes, and they're going to save you. Are they media trained? I don't think so. I think this guy is, though, because I watch his stuff, is pretty good. In a lot of cases, what I think is happening is the guy who is really good at talking is the guy, okay, you go and talk to the media. But I think when it comes to disaster response and ensuring that the messaging is done right, and within the context of ensuring that we go back to that grief cycle and ensure that it's managed properly, this is one thing that we got to start to deal with. Whew. Now, defining what constitutes control of the communication sphere. So this, again, is a strategic problem for the agencies who need to manage the communications. This idea of zero tolerance to misinformation. This is something that we have to put in place at the organizational level, at the ministerial level, and at that further government level, all the way through. It cannot be done by one agency alone. So this also, I mean, again, we talk about weaponized information and all this kind of stuff. The other thing is, how do we manage these communications teams that are on the ground? Some countries, if you put a media person in their country, there's going to be someone from a ministry follow that person around everywhere. They may or may not be a democratic country. I'll let you work out who it is. But are we in a disaster zone going to manage the individuals who communicate, the experts who communicate? Because we may not be able to stop citizen journalism. In fact, we can't. But we may want to think about managing better the people on the ground who are those first responders, who are the media, who are floating around the place. How do they become embedded? All this needs to be put into policy, put into regulations, put into organizations, put into the plans, and given the resources. You can't have these amazing plans without putting the training in place for the people like Mustafa. Where are you, Mustafa? Mustafa, who's been taking care of me for the last few days. There he is. You know, I mean, I could be like, prime example, but Mustafa knows exactly where I am all the time. I could be going to TRT World tomorrow, which I am, and give some bad interview. But Mustafa's managed me. Is that how we're going to manage disaster zones? Is it in the plan? You know, I mean, I'm from Australia. We love our freedom of speech just like the Americans and the British and everybody else. But imagine if we go back. Oops. How do we go back? Now we start to think about controlling the communication sphere. When we start to think about controlling the communication sphere, do we need to shut down Twitter sometimes? You know, it's an important question to ask. Do we need to shut down certain communication platforms? Is there a strategy in place to understand the decision-making process? Or is it an emotional decision? I don't know. We need to know. how do you, and then we saw some amazing PR done by these guys about how a lot of social media was used to find people. I don't know. I love to tweet about all kinds of stuff. If you guys follow me on Twitter, you can see I've been sitting at the back taking photos and tweeting. I don't know if I'm underneath a building. Will I think to tweet about it? I don't know. But is it a valid question? Are we asking these right questions in the context of command and control? Wait, I just want to... okay, wait. How do you go back? Sorry. I need someone to help drive these things. So, where is it? So, we go back to this idea of command and control at the governmental level, all the way down to the municipal level. There needs to be levels of control. But at the same time, if you ask the people at the Red Cross and all the NGOs and anyone who is down on the ground, even the first responders, they talk about that empathy and compassion. So what is the balance? How much research has gone into understanding what the balance is? So now, this is by far the thing that I took away from a communicator and someone who deals a lot with diplomatic services around the world. Turkey has set a new benchmark at the intersection of public diplomacy and crisis communications. This, for me, is something you should be congratulated about. Because the biggest story during that time, like the night before and for weeks before that, months before that, Russia-Ukraine war. Full stop. That's all. I'm sure President Zelensky was, of course, heartbroken by the devastation, but I can tell you he is more worried about his communication strategy, because Turkey took the limelight and for a very long time controlled this. One, through public diplomacy. Two is through the media. And you saw world leaders became your advocates. So this, I think, was by far something that, again, I hope the researchers do the research on this and the data comes out about it and we understand the value. And it's really distilling, unfortunately, distilling the value of a disaster in terms of minutes, hours, and days of airtime that delivered the strategic messages of Turkey. And I think this is where we need to understand from a strategic communications perspective, when we come back to understanding objectives, one of the objectives has to be understood in terms of that context. Another may be the humanitarian, may be the diplomatic levels, but all of these need to be drawn out in the context. And you know that you're in a disaster-prone area. So this is something I think can be very interesting. I think here, when we look at, really my last point is this critical threat to crisis communication is really this issue of misinformation. And I think we're going to have to continue to manage this, understand it, and continue to work towards better solutions. And I know at many lunches I had with Mustafa over the last couple of days, I said, look, there are things that you can do to manage misinformation. You have to understand how each platform works. You have to understand how to knock out misinformation. It's not just because it's there, you don't have to deal with it. Strategies and tactics can be put in place to deal with it. And this is something that needs to be done. Again, planning level, policy level, regulatory levels, resource level. This is where we've got to get to. And finally, I know that Turkey's communication laws are pretty impressive already, and you've done a lot of reform around these laws. But I think further criminalization, and it's kind of like, I sound awfully authoritarian all of a sudden, you know, coming from a vibrant Western democracy. But further criminalization of misinformation, especially during a crisis, should be something that is understood as a possible strategy moving forward. So with that, thank you very much.
Çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Yaz evresi bağlamında afetlerde kriz iletişimi konu başlığıyla Sayın Nordin Abdullah huzurlarınızdaydı. Malezya Kriz Yönetimi Merkezi kurucusu Mr. Abdullah'a teşekkür ediyoruz. Andrea.
Thank you so much, Nordin Abdullah, for a fantastic talk. We're going to take a coffee break, but please, we'd like to